Today, our Time for All Ages is a story that I wrote back in seminary. I was thinking about this service and what stories I wanted to tell, and I remembered this one. Like many things, it is imperfect, but it is also a work of love, and perhaps in and of itself, creating the story is part of how I've created my story. This is a story I wrote about someone I made up, a child named Nia. Nia lived in a village that lay in a deep valley with a wide river that ran through it. The village was not different from most other villages. They fished in the river, they farmed in the fields, and generally took care of each other. Nia liked to ask questions. One of her favorite questions was one that she asked everyone she walked past. What's on the other side of the river? It was her favorite question because no one knew the answer. No one from her village had ever explored the other side of the wide river and returned. As Nia grew, her curious eyes traveled the mountains, the wild trees on the other side of the river. Her heart soared with the birds, and she longed to explore as easily as they did, to climb to the top of the mountains. She imagined touching the stars that seemed to rest on their peaks. Nia wandered far and grew strong and tall, but her heart was always restless, and it seemed that life in the pleasant village grew dimmer and dimmer as the stars above the mountains grew brighter. Her mother and father and brothers and sisters and friends looked like shadows compared to the deep, mysterious life that Nia imagined across the river. And every night, she stood at the river banks and watched the stars shine like crowns on the mountains. And then one night, she waded into the river, up to her ankles, to her knees, then to her waist. And soon she was swimming along with the current, which was a strong current in the dark. She remembered her father teaching her to swim sideways and to let the current carry her to calmer waters. All the children in the village were taught how to get back to the bank, but never how to cross the river, because no one knew anyone who had crossed the river and returned. But Nia let the current carry her while she pushed forward and found herself drifting towards the far bank. She could smell the air in the forest, and her heart beat faster. She was in a new place on the other side of the river. Her clothes dried quickly from the water and protected her from the thorns and twigs as she made her way through the undergrowth towards the foot of the mountain. Soon she was climbing, and the sun was climbing in the sky too. It was getting hotter. Nia knew she needed to reach the mountaintop by nightfall so that she could meet the stars as they came out. But she also knew she needed to rest. Many years of hiking and rock climbing had taught her to pace herself. As she caught her breath, she heard a trickle of water and went to explore. She kept her hands in the cold water and remembered once a terrible fever that she had caught, as had many of the children in her village. The elders of the village had visited the children and given them a tea that tasted bitter. But then her grandmother had given her cold water and bathed her face until the fever broke. Nia finished drinking and splashed her face before she continued and remembered her grandmother. She climbed all day, and as the sun set, she reached the summit. She sat down, finally at her destination, and looked up at the sky. But what was this? Sitting on the top of the mountain, she thought she would be able to touch the stars. But the stars did not seem any closer than they had in the village. She spent the night waiting and watching, hoping that the stars would come close and touch her if she could not reach them. But when she woke up the next morning, cold and stiff, she did not feel the touch of the stars, but she remembered her dream. She remembered a dream of a star falling into her lap, and that a star that she could pick up and put in her pocket. When she woke up, her pocket was empty. So Nia trudged back down the mountain, angry that things had not worked out the way she wanted. But as she climbed, she noticed something different in the woods. She saw birds and a rabbit and 3 squirrels, all of whom were quarreling like her younger brothers. And she saw the light filtering through the trees. At the river, the cold shocked her back to her senses. And as she emerged on the village's side of the river, she felt silly. What had she been thinking? Her whole family had told her there was nothing special on the other side of the river, nothing special on the top of a mountain. And the dream that she had of a light that she carried with her was just a dream after all. As she made her way back to the village, she smelled stew cooking in her family's house. She walked towards the smell, but something stopped her. There were children playing in the street, like they usually did, but each of them seemed to glow with a light that looked a lot like the light of the star that she had carried, which was just a dream after all. She blinked, she rubbed her eyes, she shook her head. She wondered if she was still sleeping. But the children were still glowing softly. Nia started to run towards her house at the end of the block. She started to get a little bit worried. The grandmothers and grandfathers were sitting in the evening air. They also glowed like stars. She burst into her house and saw her mother, her father, her brothers, her sisters, all gathered at the table. There was stew and bread, and each one of them shined with a light that came from inside them. Her mother turned and said, "Nia, where have you been? We have been looking for you. You have been gone for 2 whole days. Sit down and eat and tell us where you have been." Her brothers scooted over to make room and led her at the table. Her sister gave her a hug. Her father poured her a bowl of stew. And Nia began to tell her story. "I went across the river and I climbed the mountain to touch the stars I have dreamed about, but they were no closer than they are here. But now that I have returned, I have found a light more beautiful and much closer to home."